This is the tale of a sparrow named Ivy Preen. Ivy's story begins, as do the stories of most birds come to think of it, in an egg in a nest. I'm afraid little is known of Ivy's parents, except that we assume they were both sparrows. But the nest was disturbed in an ivy hedge, and the parents never returned, even given plenty of time. Help was called, and the tiny baby bird, complete with nest, was transferred to a cardboard box ready for rescue. And both bird and box were taken by car to their new temporary home. Before we go any further, I would just like to point out that most of this footage of Ivy was filmed while I was away working, and some of the people who were operating the cameras for us aren't quite as used to filming as Felicity and I.
Right, you're recording now, so just hold on to it for a sec. Get close though so you can see him. Where are you, little one? There he is. Here he is.
In all seriousness, just before we go on, a little word about rescuing wild animals. If you have a wild animal that's in need, the best thing is always, wherever possible, to get it to an expert. The reason that Felicity and her family were called on this occasion was because they've rescued not only birds in the past, but also other animals as well. Back when she was even younger than she is today, Felicity and her family living in Birmingham had a hedgehog rescue. And they also had a slightly unique arrangement with the local vet. In return for giving vet care to the hedgehogs that they were rescuing, Felicity and her family also took in all manner of creatures which the vet had brought to him which needed help. They've cared for gulls, rats, pigeons, a magpie, various other birds, and on one occasion, even a fox. One of the goals with rescuing wild animals is always that you hope they're going to be able to release them back into the wild once again. For example, with Brook the fox here, once he was strong enough to transport to the mainland, Felicity and her family managed to have Brook released back into the wild through a fox charity. Even though they have all of this experience with wild animals, Felicity and her family will still go to experts when they have someone else that can take better care of the animals than they can. For example, this little pigeon here is one that we were recently transporting over to a lady on the Isle of Wight who has taken care of and rescued many pigeons. Back in 2018, having just got Ivy home, we all knew we were a long way from even thinking about releasing her. First of all, we had to get her to survive the night. And in order for her to survive the night, she would have to eat. Just a brief pause here, as I'm going to break all the rules of dramatic tension at this point in time, because I know when I watch animal programs like this on television, sometimes you can get caught up in them and sometimes it doesn't have a happy ending. And I don't want anybody watching this worrying that it's not going to be a happy ending, or I don't want to spoil the ending for anyone that wants dramatic tension in their life. So what I'm going to do in just a few moments time, I'm going to let you know on the screen, I'm going to display on the screen whether or not Ivy survived. If you don't want a spoiler for the end of this little video, then please look away now. With that sorted, let's get back to watching the first night's attempt to feed Ivy.
Head.
Trying to avoid contact with the bird to keep it wild clearly wasn't working, and so on this occasion it needed a slightly more hands-on approach to help that little bird survive.
You good, babe. You good. Yeah. Ready? Good boy.
With every feed, Ivy got more and more used to these strange new mummy birds. Ivy stayed in the cardboard box and everybody tried to avoid contact as much as possible. But Ivy had other ideas. She clearly felt safest being fed in Felicity's hands.
Here it is.
Here we go then, open your trap and stop walking.
Oh, that's better. You got it.
It was a delicate balancing act. The end goal was to get Ivy to be a wild-free sparrow, but in the meantime the most important thing was to get her to survive long enough to have that chance. And she'd clearly decided that Felicity was her safe place.
Come on. Look at his little back foot on there. Mm. You happy there?
Seemingly hour by hour, little Ivy was growing in strength and confidence.
Come on.
It won't be long before there's actual flight there, will it?
No. He's trying to go under there again. Come here. I know. That's the telling me off, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
With Ivy's strength growing, it was time to move her out of her box and, with her nest, move her into a new home with slightly more space for a young bird's wings.
Hey! Yeah. What do you think? Yeah, careful. There you go, nesty time. Yay! And he left me a little parting ball.
No.
Boy, baby.
Over the next few days, Ivy continued to grow and to get more and more self-assured.
He's burrowing slightly less today. He's only dived for my cover once properly. I think he's more confident, don't you?
But like every growing child, sometimes she had to run back to Mummy's arms.
You're going to go and look around? No. Yep. We're going to go and burrow, alright.
Little point of clarification about Ivy. You'll notice that to begin with, we didn't know whether she was a male or female sparrow, which is why throughout the old videos we used the words he and she interchangeably. Later on we did discover that she was in fact a little girl. Then, Ivy took a big step forwards. And by a big step, what I mean is...
I saw there was poo all over her cage and I thought, oh, she's been around. I didn't realise she was flying. You good, Ivy. You good, Ivy.
It was time once again to upgrade Ivy to a slightly bigger home.
Straight in, new cage up the bars and on the nest box, where I think she's going to stay until her next feed.
We also moved her feeding into a room that was slightly safer for her first short flights, although her landings still needed some work.
She's looking around to fly. Woo! Good girl! Woo!
Don't worry, despite what I thought when I first saw that video, that wasn't Ivy that fell, just one of the bars of soap off of a shelf.
Did you make a safe landing up there? Sort of.
It was decided at this point that it was time to start getting Ivy closer to nature. We'd finally reached a point where everybody thought she was going to make it. Now we had to start preparing her for release back into the wild. So she was moved into the conservatory, where she could hear the sounds of the wild birds outside.
Freedom of the conservatory. She flew out of her cage, landed on my arm, then my head, flew around the room, landed on a plant pot, and then flew back. So yes, this is Ivy. Today she was actually able to feed herself from a fat ball, but she still wants to take food from us.
With Ivy's cage now in the conservatory, and Ivy starting to feed herself, her cage was left open as much of the time as possible to allow her to fly around as much as she wanted, often under the watchful gaze of Dennis the cat. It was no secret that Ivy was starting to become a bit of a teenager. She was beginning to push boundaries.
You good girl. Don't do my sleeve, young thing. Oof, you are trouble. Excuse me. You're not supposed to chew that.
She spent a lot of time preening herself and worrying about her looks. And becoming particularly defiant when it came to bedtime.
This is Ivy, she's terrified of me. We're going to go in the cage, Ivy. We're going to go in the cage. Come on. No, don't peck my finger. No, don't eat my finger. Go in the cage. Did you see what she's doing here? She's just biting my finger. Come on, that's it. In the cage. 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 No, I don't want to not give you a smell.
Oh, hello.
Ivy Preen. Come on. Come on.
Film her where she's gone to.
Or maybe it was just that she wouldn't listen to me.
Now, what I want you to do is get back down into the cage. Let's try that again, shall we, Ivy? Come on.
We all knew that we were approaching an exciting but difficult time. Felicity and her family had done an amazing job taking care of Ivy, and she'd become part of the family. But the plan had always been for her to be a wild bird, and we were getting closer to the day when she would have to go free. To start getting her even more used to the outside world, we began opening the door of the conservatory to give her a chance to explore outside when she wanted.
Yeah. First day of having the doors open, so you have freedom outside if you want. Are you going to be brave enough to do it?
Like many young people when faced with leaving home, Ivy was understandably nervous of the open door. And so, with her on Felicity's shoulder, Felicity took her outside, intending just to let her have a look at the garden.
I took Ivy outside, and then she flew off my back, flew up onto the next level of garden in the trees there. I went outside, had my dinner out there, she didn't come back. I went up onto the next level, and she was in the very big tree there. And when I called, she tweeted so I could tell it was her. She flew onto the cables, and then she came back. So my Ivy does come back. But she is perfectly capable of flying, as long as she can find the food in the trees to feed herself. She can be a free girl.
From then on, the door stayed open as much of the day as possible, and Ivy could come and go as she pleased. And Ivy and Felicity were taking the opportunity to have as much time together as possible before Ivy flew the nest for good.
Picking up my screen, young man. Don't know what you think you're biting on there.
Realising that we needed to wean Ivy off of being indoors, Felicity began to spend more and more time sitting with her outside.
This is more how I expected the first time with her outside to go. It's not how it went yesterday, where she just took off. But it's more what I expected. Stop picking my neck. You trouble.
Then we reached a day when Ivy didn't come back in the evening. Of all the days for her to pick for her first night outside, the weather was horrendous. We'd had a long run of lovely weather, and Ivy had decided to stay outside during a summer storm. It was a sleepless night for all of us, and we just had to hope that Ivy would be okay.
After a night of adventure, she came back straight away this morning. The dirty stop out.
One of the hardest things with caring for a wild animal is that true success means that that animal is going to go off back into the wild and live a normal life, and you're probably never going to see them again. We didn't know when it would be the last time that Ivy would leave her cage and fly out the house to freedom, but we were so pleased every time she went out. Then one day it came. The day she flew out the door and up into one of the trees outside and decided that she was moving out. For the first few days, she'd pop back down and see Felicity.
Come on! Good girl! Did you get it? You're a good girl, baby.
And then one day, she decided that she was a wild bird.
Can you see her? You're a good girl. You've been exploring all day. She sat right there.
Felicity and her family had taken that tiny baby sparrow and raised it to a full-grown wild bird. For weeks afterwards, we could pick out the sound of her voice in the garden. How Ivy Preen's tale ends, we'll never know. But I know she had the best of beginnings.
My Lady Preen.